Hey guys, we're live. Candace Malcolm here with the True North Initiative. I wanted to come live today because I want to talk about this new report that was released yesterday. I kind of went through it a little bit on Twitter. There's a lot to get through, and I think that the issue is really being misrepresented, to be honest, on the media, in the media, by both sort of conservatives and liberals. So I want to go through it in a little bit more depth and talk about, again, it was 10 months ago that Justin Trudeau embarrassed all Canadians with his antics in India, and really basic questions about what happened, who was in charge, who was responsible, have yet to be answered. So this report, I think it singles in, it takes aim at some of the key players that were involved, and unfortunately, we haven't really gotten any closer to the truth. There's a lot of deflecting and pushing blame elsewhere, but there's a couple of key pieces of information that we did learn yesterday that we will go through. It's been a really busy couple of days here, a couple of weeks, I should say, in the media. Lots going on. You kind of think, it's December, things are going to slow down a little bit for the holidays, but we haven't really felt that yet. And part of it is because Justin Trudeau is off gallivanting around the world as per usual, and he just can't help but embarrass Canadians pretty much wherever he goes, whatever he does. So he was in Argentina, and he was talking at a G20 meeting, and he goes on some ridiculous feminist rant about how construction workers pose social impact in rural areas, sort of implying that you get a bunch of Canadian men in a rural part of the country and they wreak havoc and just sort of like rape and pillage or something like that. It's a pretty insulting accusation against anyone who's involved in that kind of work, or anyone who's spent time in rural Canada. Pretty much would contest some of those findings. It's kind of like a very simplistic left-wing analysis from like it's sort of what you'd expect from like a high school student or maybe like first-year university social justice warrior talking about toxic masculinity. Well, that's our prime minister. So that video was making the rounds, and then there was a post today that went viral. I shared it on both Facebook and Twitter about a young woman who does work up in one of those rural areas that gets serviced by oil workers and construction workers, and she had pretty much the opposite analysis as Trudeau. I've got a construction worker on here that found the comments disgusting. I think we all did. It's like, Trudeau's just so out of touch. He's living in his little protected bubble. He comes from a very elite family in Montreal. I don't think he's really spent a lot of time interacting with the kinds of Canadians that he so readily disparages. So that was super disappointing. And then Justin Trudeau jumps out seemingly out of nowhere to engage in a Twitter conversation with a comedian. I use that term very loosely, comedian, because I don't think Trevor Noah is very funny. He's the guy that took over for Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, and pretty much the ratings have like tanked ever since Jon Stewart left. I mean, this guy obviously had big shoes to fill, but he's just really not funny. Like, his show is basically just, instead of comedy, instead of telling jokes, he just rants from a far left perspective, complains about how horrible and racist we all are in North America. For some reason, Justin Trudeau wanted to impress this guy, so he sent out a tweet pledging $50 million to support some global citizen initiative to help celebrate the 100th birthday of Nelson Mandela. Except for, I mean, look, you could argue that the cause is worthy. It's like going to educate young girls and women in poor countries. You could argue that perhaps there was some merit in Canada giving that money away. But there's sort of layers of problems here. It's like, number one, Justin Trudeau is just virtue signaling on social media again. Number two, he's obsessed with celebrities and appealing to these far left global elites that really, you couldn't be further away from the reality of everyday Canadians by trying to show off to some, elite movie star or TV star that lives in New York City. So, why are you pledging our taxpayer money to these causes to try to impress your friends in the American media. It's like Trudeau is just so desperate for approval that he goes to these pathetic lengths. And the tone in the tweet was very much like, it was his money, it was his grand gesture, and you saw a lot of other celebrities like applauding him for it. It's like, well, this isn't his money, it's our money. And there's a lot of problems in Canada. There's a lot going on that are equally worthy, that might not get the attention of these elite left-wing celebrities, but they would be helpful nonetheless. And you can just, off the top of your head, name, veterans. How about Aboriginal communities? How about struggling oil workers? How about struggling car manufacturers? How about, the closed plant in Oshawa? How about the ongoing oil crisis in Alberta, the record high unemployment rate? I think it's 8% unemployment in Alberta, which is unheard of. Half the offices in Calgary are sitting empty because of Trudeau's policies. And yet this guy's just flippantly pledging away our money to these ridiculous causes. So shame on Justin Trudeau. Let me know where you guys are watching from. Let me know who it is that I am talking to. And I think we've got enough people on that we can just go for it. So yesterday, the federal government released this report. It's called the Special Report into Allegations Associated with Prime Minister Trudeau's Official Visit to India in February 2018. So I'll just provide a quick bit of background on that trip. I was one of the reporters that was, following it really closely, reporting it from day one. There's a lot of backstory to Trudeau going to India. Again, his trip was kind of like twofold. Number one, I think that his inner circle and the people that work around him recognize that, they like having Trudeau on the global stage. They like having him become the focal point of the international media. The international media, at least at first, were very praising of Justin Trudeau. They saw him as this sort of like liberal global rock star that was going to counter mean conservative Donald Trump. And so he would get very favorable coverage when he'd go on these international junkets. And I think they thought that this was just another opportunity to spotlight, the gorgeous Trudeau family, those kids and his wife, and, put them in costume and just have them out in the open. That was the plan. Of course, it horribly backfired because of the second element that was going on in India, which is that the Trudeau Liberals, the Liberal government general, and to be fair, other parties do this too. The NDP and the Conservatives federally both do this as well. But they love to court the ethnic vote, phone bank policies, or vote bank policies, vote bank politics, as it's called over in India, where you basically just make inroads with a specific ethnic community. You make all kinds of like really inside promises, special handouts and special deals, and then these people from this community will come out in droves and vote. They'll sign up every niece and nephew and cousin, and every person from their religious community will go and vote for a block for one candidate, and it can really have a big impact. So they're hyper organized, and they respond to bribes, essentially, public bribes. And so the Trudeau government is notorious for this kind of vote bank politics, and basically going to India was just one big election campaign strategy to court the Indian diaspora in Canada, specifically Sikh voters. And the Trudeau Liberals have been accused for the past few years of aligning themselves and courting the most extreme elements of the Sikh community. So imagine a Sikh community, in Canada. The vast majority of people are just, solid, good Canadian, hardworking people. They love Canada. They're grateful to be in Canada. Then within that, there's a very small element of people who are hyper-political. They believe in bringing their sort of tribalist ethnic politics from India into Canada, and then using Canada as a launching point to kind of combat and go after old grievances from India. And so we have this group, they're called the Khalistanis. They want to have their own independent country called Khalistan that would be carved out of India, carved out of the Punjab region. So they want Sikhs to have their own ethnic state. And this was a sort of popular political movement in the 70s and the 80s in India. It kind of hit its peak in the 80s. There was a bunch of ethnic rioting. There was sort of a pogrom against Sikhs, so a lot of Sikhs were killed. The Indian government considers these people terrorists, whereas the people themselves, they consider themselves freedom fighters for their cause. So difference of opinion there. A lot of the Sikhs ended up moving to Canada, and it was kind of like a time capsule, right? So in India, the issue was resolved. There was a lot of reconciliation, and the issue is mostly dead. I talked to so many people from India that are kind of surprised that this issue is still alive and well in Canada, because it's dead in India. It just, the movement is gone. But so many of these people moved to Canada at the height of that tension. And then you all probably know about the worst terrorist attack that ever occurred against Canadians, the Air India bombing. A terrorist mastermind from within this community blew up an airplane that was flying from Toronto, Montreal, over to Delhi, killed about 300 people. And that was in the mid-'80s. And it was, still remains the worst terrorist atrocity in our history. So Canadians have been involved in this. They've been kind of pulled into it. And there's still a very active community of Khalistanis that live mostly in suburbs of Vancouver and Toronto. They celebrate the people who carried out this terrorist attack. They celebrate the people who died in India during that ethnic sort of feud that happened in the 80s as well. And so it's hard for us in Canada because, we don't want to be insensitive to people in this community, but at the same time, when they have parades and they're carrying around banners and posters that are celebrating terrorists who killed Canadians, that's no longer just free speech. That's sort of incitement and terrorism, all that. So this is all background. The report was released yesterday, and interesting because it has the timeline here. I've got the report here. I can share the link if folks are interested in reading through it. It's pretty long report, but basically it's got the timeline. So in April 2018, the parliamentarians initiated a special review. So this is a committee within Parliament that was asked to look at the intelligence and national security issues that happened. So foreign interference and the use of security intelligence in this scandal, and included the Privy Council Office, the Canadians CSIS, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, so the RCMP, and Global Affairs Canada, so that's the Department of Foreign Affairs. And so the report was released, or the report was initiated in April. It was finished in May. And so this report was finished in May, and it was given to the Prime Minister's office. So the Prime Minister's office has had this report for almost 6 months, and yet it wasn't released until yesterday. There were 2 updates that were provided in October, and then it was finally released yesterday, December 3rd. So kind of interesting. You have to wonder why the Trudeau government held on to this report, what was going on in Trudeau's own personal office, and why he decided not to release this report. So it finally did come out yesterday. And if you watch the mainstream media and you look for your information there, you'll kind of get 2 different narratives that came out. So the more sort of establishment mainstream liberal perspective was that this report showed a failing on behalf of the RCMP. The RCMP really dropped the ball. There was sort of just a lot of confusion between these different departments that I listed, the CSIS, RCMP, and Global Affairs Canada, that just failed to communicate the fact that there was a problem. So I guess just going back, a bit more background is that Trudeau goes to India. He makes a total fool of himself with all his silly costumes. But then in the midst of it all, we learn that he had invited a terrorist as part of his entourage that was attending events with him. I was a journalist that broke that story first. I had the pictures of Sophie Trudeau and a whole bunch of other Liberal MPs and cabinet ministers posing with an individual named Jaspal Atwal, who's a convicted terrorist. He is living here in Canada. He's part of this Sikh Khalistani group of separatists and terrorists. In the 80s, he tried to assassinate a visiting Indian politician. So an Indian cabinet minister from the Punjab region was visiting Vancouver Island, and he tried to kill the guy. He shot him. A judge called it an act of terrorism, and he sort of served his time. So that was the big scandal. How on earth did a terrorist get involved in Trudeau's inner circle? How was he let into an event, to pose, take pictures with Sophie Trudeau and other Liberal cabinet ministers. He probably met the Prime Minister himself. So that was sort of the first angle that was looked at in this report. And then there was a secondary angle, which is that in the aftermath of this news report coming out and sort of all the, news stories, international kerfuffle that this caused, the National Security Advisor, a guy named Daniel Jean at the time, came out and gave an off-the-record briefing to reporters. And in that briefing, he basically alleged a massive conspiracy theory. He basically alleged that there were rogue elements in the Indian government that orchestrated the invitation of Jaspal Atwal in order to embarrass the Trudeau Liberals, in order to embarrass Justin Trudeau. So you kind of have these two elements. One, why is there a terrorist in India? Two, why is the National Security Advisor, who is a bureaucrat, who is nonpartisan, who is not a political appointee, but a civil servant, a career civil servant, why is he making these allegations? Is there any truth to them? Was security and was intelligence used inappropriately? Were his actions political? So these were the kind of questions that were supposed to be answered in this report. And so the report was let out yesterday. Again, the media pointed out that the RCMP massively screwed things up. And then on the other side, there were a lot of people, a lot of conservatives complaining that this report was just heavily redacted and that we didn't really learn anything. It was just an empty document. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer posted a screenshot of just a whole bunch. He picked one page of the report that was just heavily redacted. And he was like, this is the kind of transparency that the Trudeau Liberals are giving us. Now, it's true that a lot of the information was redacted, but it was a 50-page report and there was a lot of information. Again, I was one of the journalists that was following this story probably the closest, and I did learn a lot from reading through that document. So let's go through some of it right here. This is the main piece of information that the Liberal media picked up on. I tweeted this out. I can provide a post to it as well. I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but it's basically a timeline. So once Jaspal Atwal was added to the event list to go to this event on February 20th, this is how the RCMP had a timeline. So an RCMP officer basically determined that Jaspal Atwal was on the invitation list and that he had a criminal conviction for attempted murder, and then he was later acquitted for assault. And then for some reason, so on February 13th, he knew this, and then for some reason, he didn't pass along the information. It says that on February 14th, he left a voicemail somewhere, but there was no action because the officer was away on leave. And then basically that the information was received at the end of a shift and it wasn't passed along. So a little bit of just laziness and incompetence on behalf of the officer there. And this is sort of what the media is jumping on, saying like, oh, the RCMP dropped the ball and sort of blaming it on them. I don't think that that's entirely accurate because the report itself also says that the RCMP and CSIS both basically looked into it and they determined that this guy was not a threat. This guy was not a national security threat, and that because his criminal history was so far in the past that even though he had been a terrorist in the 80s, he was no longer considered a terrorist now. So here, this again is from the report. You can see right at the top there, it says, the RCMP stated that Mr. Atwal was not considered a threat despite his criminal history, and blank, that part was redacted. But again, so it's hard to say that the RCMP dropped the ball when their own determination was that he wasn't a security threat. So I don't think you can just simply say, oh, it was the RCMP's fault here, because they did come to the determination that they wouldn't have changed their security protocol, that they didn't consider him a threat, even though he did have this criminal background. So I don't think we can so easily blame it on the RCMP. From my analysis of reading this report, I think that the Prime Minister's office, PMO, is basically, it was their fault. They're the ones that dropped the ball, and we'll get to that in a minute. A couple of interesting points. This is just, again, background. So part of the report talked about recent Indian messaging on Sikh extremism. It says, according to government officials, there were issues raised with great regularity in bilateral meetings at all levels. And the focus was basically about the concerns that I raised at the beginning of this video about the Canadian Sikh community having this radical element. A small percentage of Sikhs in Canada are part of this extreme Khalistani network that want to have Sikh nationalism and Sikh independent state called Khalistan, and that they're sort of organizing terrorists and political events out of Canada, doing fundraising, that kind of thing. So those are the things that were raised. According to this document, the last point there, in April 2017, India's Chief Minister of Punjab refused to meet with the Minister of National Defense, who was traveling to India at the time. He accused him and 4 other Canadian cabinet ministers of being Khalistani. So there's this feud going on between the Canadian and Indian government, where the Indian government is not only accusing the Liberals of sort of courting and fostering extremism in the Sikh community, but that these extremists are actually part of the Trudeau government, part of the inner circle of the Trudeau government, which is really alarming. It's really alarming stuff that the Trudeau government is basically accusing, the Indian government, the Chief Minister of Punjab, so it's like the equivalent of the Premier of a Canadian province, is accusing the Canadian government of being infiltrated by essentially extremists and terrorists. I think that's pretty alarming, and that was something that was sort of a major takeaway for me. Another thing that we learned was that all the attention was on Jaspal Atwal. All the attention was on the fact that this guy, this one individual who had tried to kill an Indian cabinet minister, was in India. That was a story that I broke in The Sun, and then subsequently it was also written about in the CBC and other news agencies. But he wasn't the only person who was flagged and pulled. We also learned that there were 3 individuals who had their invitations rescinded. We only know the name of Jaspal Atwal. The other 2 remain anonymous, and that part again is redacted from this report. But it says right here, Canada's High Commission in Delhi sent emails to 3 individuals, and then their names are redacted. It says rescinding their invitations. And the first name direction came from the Prime Minister's office, the second from the PCO, and the third from the Canadian mission. So it wasn't just a one-off mistake that Jaspal Atwal slipped onto the guest list. There were 3 of these guys. There were 3 individuals who were, raised security issues. So that's interesting. The third thing that I wanted to raise is that if you read the CBC and if you sort of subscribe again to the Liberal narrative and talking points, they talk about how it was a low-ranking MP, a backbench rookie MP from Surrey, British Columbia. PCO, someone's asking, it's the Privy Council office. So in Canada, there's sort of like the permanent bureaucracy, and then there's the political appointees. So the Privy Council is the equivalent to the Prime Minister's office, but they're the permanent bureaucracy that always work. They're the civil servants that always work in Ottawa. And then the Prime Minister's office will change according to who the Prime Minister is. I know there's a lot of acronyms when it comes to dealing with federal government stuff. I try not to use the acronyms, but sometimes it's just easier. So again, this MP from Surrey named Randeep Suri, he's the one that came out and apologized and said that it was his fault that he released, or that he invited Jaspal Atwal, and kind of fell on the sword, or was thrown under the bus by the Trudeau government. In this report, though, it says that the MP also claimed, I think this was when he was doing a interview with Indian media or perhaps Punjab media, he said that he didn't invite the person. And so his claim was that there are no spots on the list. All I did was forward anyone who wanted to attend, who had expressed interest. So they forwarded the names. He said 25 to 30 names from different various industries. So basically all you had to do in order to get invited to Trudeau's India junket was email your local MP, say, hey, I want to go on this trip with Trudeau. The local MP's office would forward the names to the Prime Minister's office, and then it was the Prime Minister's office who created the list. And we learned there's 423 of these individuals who basically just asked if they could go to the event with Trudeau in India, and then that entire list was added. So the Prime Minister's office themselves are the ones that created the list. It's kind of rich for them to turn around and try to blame it on a rookie MP. The rookie MP says, all I did was just, kind of follow this protocol. So again, this is just trying to get to the bottom of who to blame, the blame game. I think it's pretty clear, though, that, yeah, you can blame the RCMP here, you can blame a local MP there, but at the end of the day, it's Trudeau's responsibility to make sure that he's not inviting a terrorist. It's his staff, it's his office, it's the Prime Minister's office who are in charge of these kind of like political decisions. Don't invite people who the Indian government hates. Don't invite people who the Indian government considers a terrorist. Those would be the kind of decisions that Trudeau's staff should have made. So let's move on to the part that I find the most interesting that really isn't being covered at all in the media, which is that the comments and that briefing, that bizarre briefing made by the National Security Advisor, Danielle Jean. So this is really what the crux of the report that was released yesterday talks about, and it wasn't really covered that much in the media. So if you remember, after this whole scandal broke where Jaspal Atwal was at this event with Trudeau and we're trying to figure out how on earth the Khalistani terrorist was invited, there was this really bizarre story that came out in the CBC, and it was about rogue elements in the Indian government. And the allegation was that these elements in the Indian government were purposefully trying to make Trudeau look bad, and that's how Jaspal Atwal got invited to this event. So here is the CBC story. Rogue Indian political elements may be trying to make Canada look weak on Sikh extremism. Source. So that source in this story was an anonymous source, and we later learned that the source was none other than Danielle Jean, who was the National Security Advisor. Interestingly, he retired like a couple weeks after this whole thing happened. But it was really one of the most bizarre conspiracy theories that I've ever seen. And bizarre that, again, a non-political, non-partisan, it's supposed to be impartial career civil servant was the one behind it, because it was really like grasping at straws. It was a cover-up. So we learned a lot about, well, I should say the report aimed at answering a bunch of questions about this guy, like what did he use intelligence? Did he disclose any classified information? Why did he decide to do an off-the-record briefing? Who was discussed? Who was involved? All those things were supposed to have been answered. Unfortunately, the report doesn't really get to them, and maybe that's part of the problem. Some of it was redacted, but basically, they wanted to find out, why he did it. So his explanation, Danielle Jean's explanation, was that he wanted to push back against what he thought were false stories. Again, why is it the National Security Advisor's role to try to push back against false stories? That doesn't really make any sense. Again, that's not his job. He's the top security advisor. He's supposed to be looking at national security, intelligence and national security. So, we're talking about terrorism or, foreign governments plotting things that could put Canada at harm. We're talking about national security, our safety, the safety of the Prime Minister. That doesn't really have anything to do with combating news stories that you might not agree with the premise or that you might find to be a bit misleading in India. And that was his whole thing. He was pushing back against what he considered misleading information in the Indian media, which I don't understand why he thinks that that's his role. But one of the things that we did learn was that he insisted that he was briefing journalists on his own initiative, that it wasn't sort of a favor that he was doing for Trudeau's staff or Trudeau's inner circle. It says right here, he maintained in public and in the committee that he briefed journalists on his own initiative. He also stated that he consulted the PMO prior to the briefing. The committee has email evidence that shows that he was in contact with several PMO officials prior to the briefing. And he stated during his testimony that he spoke to the PMO principal secretary prior to his briefing. The committee does not know the content of that conversation. So the PMO officials means Trudeau's political staff, so Liberals who were appointed to be Trudeau's staff. And when they talk about the PMO principal secretary, for people who follow Canadian politics closely, that's Gerald Butts. That's Justin Trudeau's best friend from the time that they were at McGill together, and he's sort of the advisor to the Prime Minister. There's been media reports that say in private, Liberal MPs call him Prime Minister Butts because that's how much power he has, and that's how much say he has. And we know also that he's sort of a radical left-wing activist who has advocated for all kinds of crazy things, including basically shutting down the oil sands in Alberta. So, he's sort of Trudeau's hyper-political go-to guy, and he's having private conversations with this bureaucrat prior to the bureaucrat briefing. That raises all kinds of red flags, obviously, especially when the committee was unable to determine what they talked about. So, on the one hand, we have Daniel Jean, who up to this point was a respected, independent guy, claiming that, it was totally his own idea. And on the other hand, he's having these closed-door meetings with Gerald Butts, which makes your mind lead to thinking, what were they scheming about? What were they talking about? How much of this was coordinated? How much of this was a cover-up to protect Justin Trudeau after this, incredibly humiliating episode is playing out. So, there's a lot of information in this document that was trying to determine just, Jean's motives and what he was doing. Because again, it was highly unprecedented. There weren't really any other examples of stuff like this happening in the past. And it just didn't really seem to fit in with his role as being the national security advisor. So they basically came to these conclusions that it was highly unprecedented for the national security advisor to give this kind of briefing to the media, that the reason why he would have done the briefing, it was unclear to the committee. The committee didn't understand why it had to be Daniel Jean. Why couldn't it have been someone else? They said that was unclear. They said that Jean didn't notify other officials from CSIS, the RCMP, or the Department of Foreign Affairs as to why he was briefing journalists. He didn't explain. He didn't tell them prior. He didn't have any kind of communication before that. And then the committee also couldn't determine why he would brief reporters off the record. So this is all not good for the national security advisor. It doesn't come right out and say that he did something wrong, but it just leaves a lot of questions that they didn't understand why he did it, and that raises important concerns. And I think that again just leads us to think that this was a cover-up. We can't conclusively say that there is any evidence that his conspiracy that he pushed about rogue elements in the Indian government was true. There's nothing that we can point to and say, oh, this is what he was talking about, or, oh yeah, there's a record of this kind of concern, or, oh, he talked to officials in foreign affairs who had a file that was about this. There was no information. It was just completely on his own. And the basic idea was that he was trying to combat media stories that he didn't like, essentially, which is just a total misuse of power, misuse of resources. And I think that the report, if the conclusion that you can draw is that it's completely unsubstantiated, that from best we can tell, he was just, part of the cover-up, essentially. And that's unfortunate when you have your senior civil servants in the government. This is what in the US they would call the deep state. This is the permanent bureaucracy meddling in the day-to-day aspects of the political appointees, the people who are actually democratically elected and then appointed by the Trudeau government. Trudeau himself was elected, and then you have these shadowy figures that usually remain nameless. In that CBC story I showed you, doesn't list his name. It just names him as an anonymous, high-ranking source. And that's the kind of thing that makes people really, skeptical about the media and the reports that they put out when, it's all based on an unnamed source. And then the unnamed source, when you look into it and when you get a report like this, it goes to show just sort of how out of left field it was and how unsubstantiated the whole thing was. So, I think at this point it's fair to say that the whole rogue elements in the Indian government was nothing but a overstatement, fake news, I would say, that there's nothing really to it. Daniel Jean can argue that, you know, it was his own idea to brief reporters, but it really seems like it was part of a political cover-up. We know that he was having private conversations with Gerald Butts prior, and then he basically came out and bailed Trudeau out of a pretty embarrassing mess, or at least they tried to. That story came out late on Sunday after this whole scandal broke. So, you know, there are still answers that remain, questions that remain unanswered. I don't think we're going to get any more, though. I think this is pretty much all there is to it. There was a bunch of recommendations that were provided by the committee. Those ones were redacted, so we don't know exactly what they were. The ones that were public were all pretty basic, like, oh, you know, MPs should have better briefings when it comes to, you know, national security protocol. And yeah, obviously we should screen and vet invitation lists to public events with the Prime Minister, so that, you know, more terrorists don't end up hobnobbing and taking photos and taking selfies with the Prime Minister and his family and the inner circle. So that stuff's all pretty basic. I could have told you that, you know, the day this stuff was happening. You know, lo and behold, it takes the federal government 10 months to come out with that report. 5 of those months, it was just being held by the federal government, by the Trudeau government, for whatever reason. And then I'll just do a final criticism here, because I think it's pretty brutal. So in the midst of this report coming out yesterday and journalists kind of going through this long report trying to figure out what the heck it's saying, the CBC released its own report. So, you know, the timing of it is just really suspicious. So federal government, after 5 months being held by the Prime Minister's office, they pick, you know, a Monday in December to release this report. And so while all these journalists are busy looking out at the 50-page report from Parliament, the CBC releases their own report, which is that they filed an access to information to receive a bunch of emails that were sent among the various government departments talking about Jaspal Atwal and talking about this security breach. And so the CBC released it at the exact same time on the same day. I don't know if that was intentionally done. I think it's pretty suspicious that it would all come out on the same day. You know, again, I've worked in the media a lot, and usually you file an access to information report, then the government gives it back to you, and it takes you a little bit of time to go through all the information. Sometimes you get thousands of pages, and you have to have a couple people going through it, reading through it, figuring out what part's newsworthy, and then, you know, you plan from there, and you decide when you're going to release it. So it doesn't just happen like instantaneously. And yet, you know, somehow, even though this happened 10 months ago, somehow we had both of these reports dropping simultaneously on the same day at the same time. So you can draw your own conclusion from that. I thought it was pretty suspicious. And so this was a CBC story that came out yesterday. Newly released emails showed Trudeau officials struggling to get ahead of the Atwal story. Of course, from the perspective of the Trudeau government, you know, they were just doing their best, struggling to come to terms with what was going on. This was the famous picture that I broke there of the terrorist Jaspal Atwal with Justin Trudeau's wife wearing her silliest Indian wedding dress there. And so again, a lot of it was redacted, and the CBC dutifully echoes Trudeau's talking points here by blaming it on that backbench MP Randeep Suri. So I don't know. I think that this was all just meant to further confuse the issue, make it seem like the whole issue with India, instead of, you know, placing the blame on Trudeau and his inner circle, and the whole problem with these guys trying to court the most extremist groups in society and rubbing elbows and recruiting people who were even considered terrorists. The story changes, the narrative changes to, oh, you know, they were scrambling to do what the best they could, and the problem was like coming from multiple angles. Blame the RCMP, blame CSIS, blame bureaucrats in the Department of Global Affairs, blame anyone, blame a backbench MP, anything they can do to divert attention away from the fact that it was Trudeau and his inner circle that really dropped the ball. and really not only embarrass themselves, but embarrass every single Canadian when we had to see, this guy, these people playing Mr. Dress Up on the world stage and courting extremists and people who our allies in India consider to be terrorists. So I think that was pretty much a low point in the Trudeau government's, in Trudeau's time in office. There's a lot of low points. He keeps managing to outdo himself and stoop even lower. I think that the India trip, though, was like the end of his honeymoon, and it was the start of Canadians really seeing just how truly incompetent and silly and foolish our Prime Minister is. And he hasn't quite been able to shake it yet. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll share a couple of those links that I mentioned to the report if anyone wants to dig through it. It's pretty dense, but it does share some insight into what was going on behind the scenes. And I encourage you to check out the True North Initiative. Check out our website. We've got a whole bunch of exciting content and things going out over there. We also have, if you want to support independent journalism in Canada, we have 2 different clubs that you can join. So they're monthly clubs. You donate monthly, and you get all kinds of cool content. You get swag. You get early access to our videos, ebooks, books that we put out. You get a copy of my latest book, and you just get to be part of the True North Initiative, which is doing a lot of great work, and got big plans for 2019 as well. We're going to start doing a bit more investigative journalism, start putting out more reports, and so really encourage you to check that out. Our website's truenorthinitiative.com. We put out a new video every single day, and we are entirely independent. We're Canadian, and you get the other side of the story. So check that out, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great evening.